Hello aspirants, welcome to Bajirao Ias Academy interview guidance program. So in today's lecture we are going to discuss a very important topic, that is with respect to the genetically modified crops or GMO organisms, right? So this genetically modified organisms have been very often in news. So it is because there were attempts by different countries to introduce the genetically modified crops. So why? Because the genetically modified crops would have solutions to the food security problem, the problem of food security, right? So because of increasing population, ensuring food security for all the population would be a serious question. However, the genetically modified crops have the answer to this particular problem, because they can increase the productivity of various crops manifold. And the other major advantage with the genetically modified crops is that they can be resistant to drought. Okay, so they can be resistant to drought, not just drought, but they can also be resistant to the pest attack. Okay, so they are also resistant to the pest attack. So withholding all these stresses, they can produce best best productivity. So because of this reason, the genetically modified crops have all continuously been in use. Now if you look at the India's profile of these genetically modified crops, so far we have allowed only the BT cotton. Okay, so this is the genetically modified variety of cotton, and this cotton had significantly increased cotton production in India. However, there were also attempts to introduce BT cotton. Okay, so BT cotton and even mustard also. Okay, so in this respect we will understand the basic nuances of genetically modified crops and what are the basic challenges that are associated with it, and why the governments are reluctant to introduce these genetically modified organisms. So why this genetically modified organisms are in use in recent times? It is because the hybrid variety of BT cotton. Now as I have already told you in earlier part of this lecture, that hybrid BT cotton is the only commercially allowed genetically modified crop in India, right? So earlier BT cotton, BT brinjal and BT mustard were also planned to introduce in India. So however, only hybrid BT cotton is the only commercial GMO crop that has been introduced in India. So however, the problem is that this hybrid BT cotton has showing signs of impact on human and animal health, because you have to understand that these genetically modified organisms or crops will have a lot of negative impact on the environment, biodiversity, as well as the human health. So because of this reason it is in news, because it says that hybrid BT cotton variety has a lot of impact on human and animal health. So in this context we will understand what are the genetically modified crops or organisms. So if you look at the basic definition of genetically modified crops, so the basic definition is, it is a genetically modified organism, right? So in these organisms what generally happens, the genetic structure of those organisms would be changed, right? So make them suitable, or make them benefit the humankind or mankind, larger mankind, right? So these genetically modified organism is any living organism, right? So this is the basic definition of a genetically modified organisms. So GMO essentially means that any living organism. However, so please understand, every living organism have their own genetic material, and the genetic material of that particular organism would be modified or changed. Okay, so why the genetic material is changed is to include certain desirable techniques. So those techniques would help humanity, help mankind, or help the wildlife, right? So for example, certain crops, the genetic structure would be changed so that we can address the problem of food security. Okay, now if you look at the genetically modified organisms, so GMOs, so there are certain cattle varieties, their genetic structure is changed to ensure that they produce higher milk productivity, ensure higher milk productivity. So therefore this is the basic definition of the genetically modified organisms, right? So this is a GMO is a living organism whose genetic material has been modified or changed to include certain desirable characteristics or certain desirable techniques, right? So when we talk about the example of when we talk about the GM crops, so earlier we talked about the genetically modified organisms. Now when we talk about the GM crops, so these are the crops genetic modification involves manipulation of a DNA, right? So in this GM crops, what they do, they manipulate or they modify the DNA instead of using the controlled pollination. Okay, so therefore it improves the crop productivity and it also alters certain characteristics of those crops. So overall the objective of introducing GM crops to introduce to increase shelf life of a product, food product, agriculture product, and to make agriculture crops salinity resistant, and even make them drought tolerant. So these were the basic objectives with which the GMO crops are being introduced. When we talk about the examples of these GM crops, soya bean, maize, cotton, and canola, so with herbicide tolerance, right? So they have the herbicide tolerance and also insect resistance. So they are most widely grown GM crops around the world. Now if you look at the India's case, India has only allowed BT cotton. So please also remember, India had not allowed any food crops, genetically modified food crops in our country, because keeping in mind the health impacts of these GM crops on the people and also on the environment. So therefore apart from the cotton, other countries have also introduced soya bean, maize, and canola. So they have certain characteristics. They are herbicide tolerance and insect resistance, right? So these crops that we have discussed are most widely grown GM crops across the world. Now in this context we will understand few more GM crops that are in India, right? Okay, first and foremost we need to talk about the BT cotton, right? So here BT means Bacillus thuringiensis, right? So that is the meaning of BT, Bacillus thuringiensis. Okay, so that is the meaning of BT cotton. So the BT cotton was introduced in 2002 in India, and it remains the only GM crop so that has been permitted so far. So earlier also I have told you this, that BT cotton is the only GM crop that is allowed in India for a commercial cultivation. So after that there is a HTBT cotton variety also. This is the cotton variety which is in use because it had a lot of impacts on the environment as well as the human health. So however, this HTBT cotton variety is a herbicide tolerant BT cotton variety, right? So it has unapproved this HTBT cotton was unapproved in India, right? So the approval is given by genetic engineering appraisal committee. Okay, so this was not permitted in India because of its larger impact on the human health and environment. So after that there's another variety of GM crop, that is DMH11 mustard. So if we can talk about this is the first GM food crop in India, so that has permitted for the commercial release. Okay, so that has actually released for the commercial release, and it is the first GM crop in India, right? So it has also confers the tolerance to glufosinate ammonium. This is an herbicide that kills the weeds. Okay, so this is the herbicide tolerant mustard variety. Okay, so herbicide tolerant mustard variety. So after that we should also talk about the BT brinjal as well. The Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee had recommended for its commercial release, but it was blocked in the year 2010. Okay, so this was also blocked because it also have a larger health impacts on the people. So because of this reason, the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee, even though permitted for the commercial cultivation, it was blocked in the year 2010. Right. So now in this context we will try to understand briefly the challenges that are associated with these GM crops. So not just the challenges, but also certain benefits or the advantages which are associated with the GM crops. Now if you look at the GM crops, they are unnatural in nature, because those GM crops are produced in a laboratory conditions, modifying their genetic structure, right? So they do not use the traditional breeding and selection techniques. So when we talk about the traditional breeding and selection techniques, so they are more natural in nature, right? So they are more natural in nature. So on the other hand, the genetically modified crops cannot be considered as natural, way of breeding. Rather, it can be termed as unnatural way of breeding. So because since it is unnatural in nature, there's a chance that it can produce unintended effects or impacts on the people, on the environment, the biodiversity, and on the health of people. So however, one thing that we need to understand, that those impacts would not be immediately visible on the people. Okay, so I can say that they are more gradual in nature, not sudden, but those changes in the environment, biodiversity, and human health would be gradual, and they took place over a period of time. So however, the government had come up with a rules of 1989. Okay, so GMO rules of 1989, and this GM crops are also against the rules of 1989. Okay, so this particular rules of 1989 have described that GMO crops are hazardous in nature. So hazardous in the sense that they are hazardous for the environment, they are hazardous for the ecosystem and the biodiversity. So if we talk about the rules of 1989, so those rules says that the manufacturing, use, import, export, and storage of hazardous microorganisms or genetically engineered organisms or cells under the environment protection. Okay, so they prohibit the rules of 1989, and these rules were framed under the Environment Protection Act of 1986. So under this particular rules, the manufacture, use, import, export, and storage of genetically modified organisms was banned, right? So because of this reason, we can say that this genetically modified crops or organisms are hazardous in nature. Since they are hazardous in nature, they are against the rules of 1989. Okay, so after that we should also talk about the environmental impacts of these genetically modified organisms. Okay, so it is very often caused by the cross transfer of pollen by the bees. Now if you look at natural way of pollination of species, so it generally through cross transfer of pollen grains through the wild bees, right? So and other domestic crop varieties. So however, with the GM crops this is not the case, and that also reduces the genetic diversity, crop diversity in the nature, and that could also have a serious implications on the food security of our populations. Right now, other thing that you have to understand, that there may be chances that these genetically modified crops would have a lot of negative impact on the would have a lot of negative impact on the sustenance of these bees as well. So that could reduce the population of these bees, and it could also have a serious impact on the biological diversity. Now if you look at the total biological diversity sites, so India is one of the biodiversity hotspots, right? So out of 17 biodiversity hotspot, India is listed as one of the biodiversity hotspot. Okay, so therefore mustard, brinjal, and rice, so with commercialization of GM crop, contamination is unavoidable. So there may be the contamination, and that could destroy the biodiversity of our country. So because of this reason, we have not introduced GM crops so far for the commercial cultivation. Now in this context we will briefly understand the benefits right? So it has certain benefits as well as certain drawbacks as well. So we try to take this moment to understand benefits of GM crops. So as I have already explained you that most of the genetically modified crops will ensure better pest and disease resistance for those crops, and they should also have the greater tolerance of stress, and stress include drought, low temperatures or salt in the soil. That essentially means that higher levels of salinity can also be tolerated by these genetically modified crops. So after that, they substantially increase the crop yield, and it also results in faster growth of those crops, and they can be cultivated and harvested in areas with a very short growing seasons. And the next major advantage is that they can also be made resistant to the specific herbicides as well, right? So these are the major benefits or major advantages of the genetically modified crops. So however, it also comes with certain drawbacks as well. So drawbacks of genetically modified crops, so they can cause unpredictable side effects first and foremost. So the HTBT cotton, so that is in news. So this had a lot of negative impact on the human health. Because of this reason it was not introduced, and they can cause ecological damage as well, and they can lead to overuse of herbicides, not accessible to every poor farmers, and problem with the intellectual property rights as well, right? So these are the major drawbacks that are being associated with the genetically modified crops. So why I say that they cause ecological damage, because when we introduced genetically modified crops for commercial cultivation, what they do, they can kill the local the naturally available plant varieties, and they can also have a substantial impact on the soil microorganisms, and not just soil microorganisms. Over a period of time, what happens, they substantially decrease or reduce the biodiversity of an area, right? So lead to overuse of herbicides as well, because of introduction of the genetically modified crops, and they are also not accessible to every poor farmers, because they introduce a technology called a terminating technology. So terminating technology in the sense that the seeds which are produced or purchased by the farmers, from a private company. For example, imagine a farmer purchased seeds from a private company, and those seeds would be helpful for only one crop season. Okay, one crop season, and in the next season farmer have to purchase the seeds again from the company. So therefore we can say that they are not accessible for the every farmer, right? So these are the major drawbacks that are associated with the genetically modified crops, right? So there are certain other concerns that are being associated with the BT cotton as well. Okay, so what are those concerns? So we need to talk about the value capture mechanism. The value capture mechanism in the sense that it prevents farmers from saving seeds, and it also increases the cost of buying seeds, and they should also pay royalties to the developers of these GM seeds. So this is the first major disadvantage that is associated with the BT cotton variety. So the mechanism, as I have already told you, that farmers are not allowed to save the seeds. Even if they save the seeds, those seeds will not be useful for the next crop. Okay, so that is the main problem that is being associated with the BT cotton. Next, we should also talk about the higher cost of these GM seeds, right? So there was a phenomenal threefold increase in the labor cost in hybrid cotton cultivation. So that essentially means that even though they have been increasing the productivity, the input costs of the farmers have been significantly rising, right? So poor farmers cannot afford significant increase in the input cost. If you look at this, there's a threefold increase in the input cost on the agriculture. Okay, so therefore this could have adverse effect on the farmer revenues. So whatever farmer has been earning, right, so that could significantly impact the farmers' revenues, and this could also increase the distress among farmers and suicides among the farming community. Now if you look at the Indian agriculture, farmer suicides is one of the major problem that Indian farmers have been facing. So therefore increased distress because of the higher cost a higher input cost, that could also lead to the farmer suicides. So this cannot address the problem of farmer suicides as well. Now if you look at the GM crops, while cultivating those crops, they require more water, fertilizer and insecticide. So that could lead to the overuse of these chemical fertilizers, pesticides, right? So what happens is that they can degrade existing environment, right? So they can substantially degrade the existing environment, right? So and is also vulnerable to several other pests and diseases. We cannot say that it is a foolproof in nature. The technology is foolproof in nature, and it is also vulnerable to water, fertilizer and insecticides as well. So apart from that, the other major problem which is being associated with this BT cotton is lower levels of yield, and it has also a long season and lower density, so that could reduce yield potential and increases the pest pressure as well. And after that, we should also talk about the monopoly as well. Okay, so BT cotton seeds have become unaffordable to the farmers due to higher royalties, right? So now farmers have to pay the higher prices to purchase these BT cotton varieties, right? For example, earlier Monsanto company that used to produce BT cotton used to charge higher prices from the farmers to purchase BT cotton seeds. And in fact, Monsanto has a near monopoly over the BT cotton seeds, which led to the total market collapse. Okay, so these are the major concerns that are being associated with the BT cotton varieties in India. So after that, there are certain other concerns with BT brinjal as well. So BT brinjal had higher levels of toxicity, okay, because it contains the toxic gene, and this toxic gene has been extracted from a soil bacterium, right? So this toxic gene had been extracted from a soil bacterium. So because of this reason, it had a very high toxicity, and it has been confirmed by the several experts as well in the past. So because of this reason, the BT brinjal introduction was blocked in the year 2010. So after that, we should also talk about the regulatory issues that are associated with the BT brinjal. The Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee, so that used to give approval for introduction of these GM crops, for the cultivation, for the larger commercial cultivation. The Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee and the developer of BT brinjal so did not follow the proper safety protocols and transparency norms while designing or manufacturing these BT brinjal seeds. So therefore, Supreme Court had ordered in the year 2007 that every company which manufactures these GM crops or GM seeds must follow the safety protocols and transparency norms. However, with respect to the BT brinjal variety, these safety norms were not followed strictly. So this is another major problem that is being associated. So after that, there's a lack of surveillance as well, because BT brinjal was the first GM vegetable food crop in the world to be approved for the commercialization, for the commercial cultivation. However, the problem here is that without adequate oversight and scrutiny by the international scientific community, introduction such a food crop first in the world would not be advisable, considering larger impacts of such GM crops on human health and environment. So India is the center of world's biological diversity in brinjal production, with over 2,500 varieties grown in the country, and as many as 29 world species of brinjal are available. So this is all about the BT crops that were introduced in India. What are the concerns associated with them? What are the benefits with the BT brinjal? So however, if I can say that before introducing the genetically modified crops or organisms, make sure that they do not have negative impact on the environment and human health. They should not degrade the existing biodiversity. So therefore, all the protocols, safety protocols and the norms that were laid down by different institutions have to be followed to make sure that these genetically modified varieties are safe for the human consumption and also for the natural environment. Okay, so that's all in this lecture, and thank you.